Mr. Death and the Redheaded Woman by Helen Eustis. Mr. Death come a-riding in from the plains on his pale stallion, a-shooting off his pistols, bangety bang bang, till you'd have thought some liquored-up Injun was on a spree. Hooey! We was scared, all us little uns, and the grown folks too, only to them he seemed more familiar. But he never touched nary a soul that day but Billy be damn Bangtree, the one the girls was all crazy for, and Mr. Death no more'n just laid a finger on him so he didn't die right off, but lay there cold and sweatin', dying of a bullet in his belly which was shot off by a drunken cowpoke in a wind euchre game. Now many a girl in our town wet the pillow with her tears when she heard how young Billy was like to die, for he was a handsome man and drove all women wild. But the one that cried and carried on the worst was pretty little Maud Applegate, with the freckles and the red hair. Old Injun Mary was a nursin' Billy with poultices and healing herbs, and wouldn't let no other women near his door, so there wasn't nary a thing Maud Applegate could do for him. But you can't expect a red-headed woman to just sit around and fret, like you would another colored girl, and Maud was no exception to that rule. Though she cried and carried on for a while, she pretty soon decided something had to be done, so she dried her eyes on her pettiskirt, saddled up her daddy's pinto pony, and took out across the plains after Mr. Death. Maud Applegate rode high and she rode low. She rode through the cow country into the sheep country, through the sheep country into the Injun country, through the Injun country to the far mountains, and there at last she caught up with Mr. Death, just about a mile from the trail, from the little old shack where he lived with his granny up above the timberline. When Maud Applegate spied his pale stallion, she was mighty tired and mighty weary. Her red hair was all tumbled down her back, and her daddy's pinto wasn't no more'n skin and bone. When she caught her breath and sang out loud, "Oh, wait up, Mr. Death! Wait up for me!" Mr. Death, he pulled up his pale stallion and looked around surprised-like, for there isn't many that call out to halt him. "Why, what you want, missy?" he asked Maud Applegate as she rode up alongside. "Jumpin' Jehoshaphat if you don't look like you rode clean through the briar patch." "Oh, Mr. Death," Maud panted out, "I rode high and I rode low after you. I rode through cow country into sheep country, through sheep country into Injun country, through Injun country to the far mountains, and all to ask you, would you spare Billy be damn Bangtree, my own true love?" At that Mr. Death throwed back his head, so his black sombrero slipped off and hung round his neck by the strings, and he laughed out loud. "Now ain't that cute?" said Mr. Death. "Honey, I reckon you're just about the cutest thing I'm likely to see." But Maud Applegate, she'd rode high and she'd rode low. She'd stood thirst and she'd stood hunger. She'd like to be kill her daddy's pretty little pinto. Furthermore, she was a red-headed woman, and she wasn't going to be laughed at, so she took and cussed out Mr. Death good. She told him that where she come from no gentleman laughed at no lady in her true trouble, and she'd thank him to mind his manners with her, and she'd like to know who brought him up anyhow. Why, she knew dirty necked Injun bucks acted better than him. She'd lay his mammy's ass as pining in her grave, and so on. Well, Mr. Death, he sobered down shortly and sat up straight in his saddle and listened real still, with only his eyes a-blinking. When Maud gave out a breath, he took out a baccy bag, licked the paper, and rolled him a smoke. "What'll you give me for Billy be damn Bangtree?" said he. But Maud Applegate, she was really wound up. She tossed her hair like a pony's mane and made a sassy mouth. "I ain't a-gonna talk business until I've washed my face and had me a bite to eat," said she. "I've rode high and I've rode low." All right, said Mr. Death. "Ride along now, and I'll take you to my cabin, where my old granny will take care of you." So Maud and Mr. Death, they rode up the slope, Mr. Death reining in his pale stallion to keep down the poor tired pinto, until presently they come to a little old shack with smoke coming out of the stovepipe. There was Mr. Death's granny a-standing at the door, as pleased as Punch to see some company. "Why, you're right welcome, missy," she sang out, soon as they were within calling distance. "The pot's on the stove and the kettle's aiming. Come right in and rest yourself a while." So they pulled up. Mr. Death swung down off his pale stallion, come around by Maud, and lifted her right down to the ground with his two big hands a-meeting around her little waist. "Oh, ain't she the purty little thing?" his granny kept a-saying, all the while, and hobbling around the dooryard on a crutch like a bird with a broken wing. Then she taken Maud inside and give her warm water, and a ivory comb, and a pretty silk wrapper from out of her old brass-bound chest. And when Mr. Death come in seeing to the hosses, there's Maud Applegate, a-settin' like a red-headed angel drinking tea. Maud, she perked up soon as she got some victuals inside her, and presently she had Mr. Death and his granny laughing fit to burst with her comical tales of the folks back home. Soon Mr. Death, he set in to yawning and gaping. "I've rode a fair pace today," he said to his granny. "I've been twice around the world and back, and I think I'll lay my head in your lap and catch 40 winks." And shortly he was a-snoring. Then Death's granny began to talk low to Maud Applegate, questioning her all about herself and where she come from and why she come. So Maud told her about how Billy-be-damn-bang-tree, her own true love, lay a-dying of a bullet in his belly. So what could she do but take out after Mr. Death and beg him to stay his hand? When Death's granny had heard the whole story, she fetched a great sigh. "Well," she said, "it's a great pity to me that you got your heart set, for you're like the girl I once was, and if I had my way, you're the girl I'd choose for my grandson to marry, for I'm old and tired, would like to see him settle before I go to my rest. You're young and you're pretty, and you don't stand for no sass, and if my old eyes don't deceive me, you can do a bit of witching too, now ain't that true?" "Well," Maud answered her modestly, "just a little of the plain." "Like what now?" said Death's granny. "White or black?" "Little of both," said Maud. "Witched my little brother into passing his arithmetic, and I also witched the preacher's wife so she tripped on her shoestring and fell in the horse trough." Once more Death's granny fetched a sigh. "Hey, that's a good start for a young'un," she said. "Don't look to me like a girl like you ought to waste herself on no drunken gambling cowhand gets himself shot up in some fool card game. Howsoever, if you got your heart set, I'll help you. Whatever Death catnips this way, he shortly begins to talk in his sleep, and when he talks, he'll answer 3 questions truly, and then wake up. What shall I ask him for you?" "Ask him," said Maud right away, "what is his price to let off Billy-be-damn-bang-tree?" "That's one," said Death's granny. "You got 3 questions. What else?" At this, Maud had to think, and presently she said, "Ask him why he took my baby sister from her cradle." "Very well, child," said Granny. "And one more." Then Maud Applegate bent her red head near to the red fire and was still, But at last she said kind of low and slow, "Ask him what he does when he's lonesome." To this, Death's granny answered nothing at all, and so they sat in quiet until shortly Death began to mumble in his sleep. Then his granny took a hold of a lock of his coal-black hair and tweaked it, gentle-like. "Yes," Death said, but without waking up. "Yes." "Tell me, son," Death's granny said, bending over his ear, "what will you take to let off Billy-be-damn-bang-tree?" At this, Death twitched and turned in his sleep. "Oh, Granny," he said, "she's such a pretty girl. If it was some, I'd make it an eye. If it were others, I'd make it 10 years alive. But for her, I'll make it that she must ride with me 2 times around the world and give me a kiss on the lips." At this, Maud drawed a great deep breath and leaned back in her chair. "Well, son," said Granny, "here's another question she asked of you. Why did you take her baby sister from the cradle?" Then Death twisted and turned in his sleep again. "She was sick," he said. "She was full of pain. I took her so she never need cry no more." At this, Maud bowed her head and hid her cheek in her hand. "Well, son," said Death's granny, "and here's the last. What is it you do when you're lonesome?" At this, Death gave a regular heave and a great groan and turned his face from the light of the fire. For a long time he whispered and mumbled, and finally he said real low, "I peep through the windows at how the human beings sleep in each other's arms." And with this last, he woke up with a jerk, gave a mighty yawn, saying, "Oh, my stars, I must have dropped off." Now Mr. Death and his granny was cheerful folks in spite of his profession, and that evening they gave Maud Applegate such a high old time that she was almost glad she come. Death's granny, she told some mighty edifying stories about her young days, and furthermore, she got out a jug of her blackberry wine, and Death, he played such merry tunes on his fiddle that Maud Applegate got right out of her chair, picked up her skirts, and danced. It was late that night when Death's granny showed Maud to the little trundle bed all made up fresh beside her own four-poster. In the morning, Death's granny had Maud's own dress all mended and pressed for her, and a fine breakfast of coffee and ham and grits to stay their stomachs for the long trip. And when Mr. Death brought round his pale stallion, still saddled and bridled to go, the tears was standing in his granny's eyes as she kissed Maud Applegate goodbye. "Goodbye," Maud said. "I thank you for your fine hospitality, and if it wasn't for Billy-be-damn-bang-tree, my own true love, I'd be right sorry to go." Mr. Death, he lifted Maud up on his big stallion and leaped astride, then away they rode, right up the snowy mountain top into the sky, and Maud Applegate was surprised to find herself warm and comfortable, riding pillion with her arms wrapped around Mr. Death's waist. Then didn't they have a ride? Mr. Death, he rode his pale stallion up the mountains of the storm to the pastures of the sky where the little cloud was grazing beside their big fat white mammies, and the big black daddy clouds kept watch around the edge, and he rode right up in the fields where the stars grow and let Maud Applegate pluck a few to wear in her red hair. He rode past the moon, and when Maud Applegate reached out and touched it, it was cold as snow and slippery too. They couldn't go too near the sun, Mr. Death said, lest they get burned.